That Thursday started like any other. It was deer season, and the nip in the air made me rethink my morning run. Usually I jog around the lake right away in the morning, totaling a little over a mile and a half. But that day was cold, and like I said, it was deer season. Even though I was planning on wearing a blaze orange vest so I wouldn't accidentally get shot, shit does happen. Around the time the coffee pot started dripping, my cousin Richard called. We're not close. Never were. Never had the opportunity to know the other one, really. The only thing I know about him is what I read on his Facebook page, which is enough for me to nod in acknowledgement when I see him around. But for the most part, I just try to avoid him. Both he and his wife are the same, at least from what I see on the internet. You know the kind of person I'm talking about. Always ranting about them versus us, spreading AI videos, proving the existence of an ancient giant samurai race. Not a race, by the way. And saying how some shadowy archaeologist Illuminati is covering it all up. Hey, Richard, I started. Get over here, quick! Richard said, out of breath. I started. But before I could finish, Richard repeated himself. Get over here, man! Bring your guns! He said before hanging up. Not only do I not own a gun, a fact he should be aware of considering how vocal I am about politics, but there was something in his voice that made me think he didn't want to bring me out hunting. It sounded like he was scared. I called him back, but he didn't answer. Instead, a few minutes later, he texted me, "Get over here," followed by a blurry photo of his truck's flatbed. Richard only lives a few miles from me, and I figured taking the time to see what was happening at his place might go over better than texting or calling him again. His home is a small, rundown farm that's been in his family for about 100 years, though it hasn't seen cattle or upkeep in at least 20. The one-story house is kept in a similar fashion, in dire need of new furniture, carpets, and appliances. What those antiquated things replaced decades before can be found in a sinkhole at the edge of the property that acts as a sort of graveyard. In the back, there used to be fields that Richard and his family used to chop hay on. But over the years, these fields have been reclaimed by the woods 1 inch at a time. Nature would receive a helping hand when Richard converted about 20 acres into a hunter's paradise. This includes a small man-made pond and an apple orchard. While Richard and Sarah may view this as a hunter's paradise, it really is surprisingly environmentally friendly considering who built it. We may live in the same small town, but like I said, we aren't close. So I never got to see the place in the flesh until this happened. The only reason I knew anything about the land is because this is something he loves to brag about on Facebook. And even though I'm not a hunter, I can enjoy the beauty he's surrounded by. Pulling into Richard's driveway, I saw him standing in the flatbed of the truck with his gun in hand. He looked anxious, but relieved that I was there. "Thank God," he said as I got out of my car. "Did you bring your gun?" "I don't have one," I admitted. Richard let out a short groan, but was quick to say, "Doesn't matter. We have some you can use. Actually, take this one," he said, handing me his bolt-action rifle. "Why would I want a gun?" I asked, without taking the weapon. "Look, just take it," Richard said gently, but running out of patience. Humoring him, I took the rifle, and made sure I pointed it towards the ground. "I'm gonna run in the house, grab another. I'll be right back," he said, as he hopped off the truck and ran off. I was worried. Guns made me uncomfortable, and the way Richard was acting made me envision the two of us being in a standoff with someone. Not something any sane person wants to be in, if you were to ask me. But I wasn't so sure Richard was in his right state of mind. The last 10 years, give or take, changed everyone on his side of the family. As I walked around Richard's truck, I took a look in the flatbed. What I saw froze me to the spot. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. That blurry photograph? It wasn't blurry at all. That's how this animal's hair looked. Animal? I'm not an expert, but I think I would have heard about an animal this size in my neck of the woods. Even though it was curled up into a ball, it still had to be at least 7.5 feet tall. Its shoulders, though? Holy hell. Its shoulders were as wide as my leg is tall. I don't know how long I was standing there before Richard came running out of the house. A smile from ear to ear, and an AR-15 in his hands. Thanks to social media, I know that gun's name is Brenda, and is fully kitted out. What this means exactly, I don't know. I do know there are a bunch of things under the barrel, and that the sight cost nearly as much as the gun did. Sitrep is as follows, Richard called out. We called a friend in the DNR who told us about this doc in some university. Might be able to help out with this. Sarah left about 5 minutes before you got here to meet him. She took a finger. I had a lot of questions, but the only thing I could think to ask was, what? Richard's expression went from confused to thoughtful, before melting into a huge grin. You haven't figured it out yet? No, I admitted. Fucking college? Ruined that brain, man, Richard said, as he put a hand on my shoulder and gestured towards the flatbed with a cock of his head. I shot a fucking Sasquatch. I didn't know what to say about this, so I said nothing. Now, I didn't do this to get Richard to keep talking the way the police might use silence as a tool. I was too surprised to do anything else. I know you have questions, and I don't have many answers for you, and for that, I'm sorry. However, your family, and I'll give you 20% if you stay. 20%? I asked, my head still reeling. Yeah, Richard answered. He then saw the next question on my face, the one asking, who would pay for a Bigfoot carcass? And answered it. Did you know there are people in the world who poach tigers? You know why? Because it's fun? I asked, thinking about why any hunter might shoot an animal. Well, sometimes, sure. However, there's a lot of jail time, a lot of risk. The real reason people poach tigers is because someone still thinks that eating their whiskers will make them more virile, or that their bone marrow will cure some disease, Richard said. People pay a lot of money for that shit. I'm not agreeing with it, but it's just how things are. Now, with that in mind, imagine what they would pay for a fucking Bigfoot. Things were a blur at that point, but needless to say, I helped Richard make room for the body in his basement's chest freezer. It was a struggle to make it fit inside, but we managed. As this was going on, Richard was talking non-stop, retelling what happened to him shortly before he called me. Apparently, early that morning, when Richard was in the stand, he saw movement, and assumed it was a deer. He kept an eye on it, in hopes that it was a large buck, or maybe a doe that might attract a buck, because he was in the mood to hang a large rack on the wall that year. 10 to 15 minutes later, Bigfoot got close enough for Richard to recognize it for what it was, and that was when he shot the massive beast dead. A single round entering, but not exiting, the chest. When I asked why his wife took a finger, Richard said it was to show somebody at the university to prove it was real. Once they categorize Bigfoot's DNA and add him to the animal tree at Disney, Richard said as we were cooking the steaks that had to be taken out of the freezer, I'll start the bidding at $10 million. I'm sure it'll reach 100 by the time it's sold. So this was why Richard wanted us to have guns ready. If this body was worth even half as much as he thought, people would want to steal it from us. And for that much money, violence would be a guarantee. After getting situated and shown the spare bedroom I would be using, in the basement, 20 feet from Bigfoot's body, Richard went over the house rules, which were easy enough to follow. Because I had the least experience with guns, I wasn't expected to be handling the weapons. Instead, I would be trusted watching the CCTV cameras. There are 4 cameras in total. The one on the porch faces the wood line. The 2 that are on the deer stands oscillate. And the last one is the view from just above the garage, facing the driveway. It wasn't as fancy as you might think. Richard has always been known for being cheap, so it wasn't hard to imagine these being secondhand. This is something I guessed even before seeing the sticker on the tape reading McGill's Bar and Grill. While getting something secondhand is perfectly fine, the quality of the recording it provided wasn't much better than nothing at all. Each camera was grainy, out of focus unless you were standing close enough to touch the lens, and were all in black and white. None of them picked up any audio. When Sarah returned, it was nearly supper time, and Richard was in the middle of cooking a roast that had to be taken out of the freezer to make room for the body. "What's the word?" Richard asked when she got out of the car. "They're looking at it. She said the soonest it'd be is about 3 days. 3 days? Richard asked, the disbelieving question bursting out of him. Sarah shrugged. That's what they said. The doctor's name who was doing all the testing was Lillian Corbeck, and Richard being Richard, didn't trust her. It wasn't personal. He's big into conspiracies, and was convinced there's a cryptozoology Illuminati, or something to that effect, and that they were gonna steal the body. After doing a little reading up on her, he discovered that she had 3 doctorates, but even then, he still wasn't satisfied. Eventually, I finally convinced him to sit down and relax a bit. Worrying wasn't going to do anyone any favors, and Richard has a bad habit of pacing while talking out issues to himself. I can only speak for myself, but I found it very stressful to be around, especially when you're already in a stressful situation. This was made even worse due to the fact that every so often, Richard would convince himself that he'd seen someone in the woods. I don't know if Richard's hallucinations were real, brought on due to stress, or if he had some mental illness or was on drugs. To be honest, none of these would be surprising. That night, Richard expected all of us to sleep in shifts. However, that was not going to happen. We were too excited about the prospect of all the money we would make. Both Sarah and I discussed this at length and in depth, but Richard's favorite thing to talk about was his conspiracies, including how people were going to steal the body and that we all needed to be on edge. In the morning, Sarah went out hunting in one of their stands. Richard was a bit shocked by this when there was so much at stake in the freezer, but she complained about how she didn't get to kill anything yet, as if that was such a bad thing. However, it was enough for Richard to relent and wished her good luck before she headed out. I used to hunt back in the day, but I've never understood that mentality. It always seemed cruel. An excuse to kill. I kept these thoughts to myself. After we ate some oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins for breakfast, Richard started to complain about how he didn't get to fill out his deer tag. Sure, I killed Bigfoot, but it's not the same, you know? It wasn't even 9 in the morning before he decided to go out, but told me to stay inside so I could protect the asset. As annoying as being invited over then stuck babysitting a carcass in a freezer was, thinking about the money made me believe it would be worth it. I passed the time by reading the book I brought with me. As it turned out, reading a horror anthology about a creepy cabin, well, in a creepy cabin, along with a dead Bigfoot, isn't the best combination. It was a little after noon before Sarah and Richard returned, and both said the same thing. The woods were quiet. I didn't know if they meant this literally or if this was just an expression, and I didn't ask. In truth, the question never occurred to me until now, writing this. Because both of them were there to watch the freezer, I went back home and grabbed a few things for the stay. I would have preferred not staying over there with those two, but the money was too much to pass up on. I could suffer those two for a few more days. Things got weird on the second night. It started around 1 in the morning, and at first we all assumed it was the sound of hail hitting the side of the house. However, it wasn't as frequent as you would expect with hail, and there was nothing in the forecast. Plus, it sounded too heavy. Up until then, we sort of tuned it out, never gave it much thought. That is, until a fist-sized rock went through the window. That was when the hooting in the woods started. "What the hell?" Sarah asked, as Richard stuck his head out the window to get a look at who or what was out there. That's when the noises became grunts and hisses. Richard, white as a sheet, put his head back in the house and checked to see if his gun was loaded. "Shut all the windows and blinds. Turn off the lights," he ordered. "Why?" I asked. "We are under siege." Sarah went into action immediately, but I just stood there, not understanding what was going on. All I heard was the noises from outside. They were filling the air like a drum beat, coming from dozens of drummers who were all keeping their own rhythm. This sound would keep going for at least 15 minutes. I asked who was out there, but Richard and Sarah were reluctant to say the answer out loud. Eventually, they answered me. "Bigfoot and his family. They want revenge." In the dark, we kept quiet and watched the tree line. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things moving in the dark or not, but Sarah did make a few remarks about how she thought she saw movement a few times. Richard kept silent about it, if he saw anything else that night, but his demeanor changed. Before, his gun was always beside him, but from that night onward, it was almost never holstered, and it was always in his hands. I expected Richard and Sarah to fire into the woods, but neither did since it was dark and neither had a clear view. "Shooting into the dark's a waste of ammo," Sarah added. We checked the recordings from the cameras, but they turned out to be next to worthless. There was movement in one of the cameras at one of the stands, but it was little more than a blur, and could have been anything. The rest of the footage wasn't much better. Nothing was in focus, so a skeptic could easily explain any movement by claiming it was the wind. The next morning, as Sarah made phone calls to know of any updates from the lab, I helped Richard in the shed. When I asked what we were doing there, he said, "I'm gonna make some anti-Bigfoot traps. Either nab a second bastard or scare the rest of the troop off." "Troop?" "Yeah, troop. Like monkeys, gorillas, a school of fish, flock of birds, troop of Bigfoot." It made sense to me. I didn't question it further. The traps we made mostly involved just digging a hole, burying a board with nails driven through it, and covering it up with twigs and leaves. We must have done this a few dozen times, but that wasn't the only trap Richard used. He also had snares and huge metal monstrosities that would shatter bones. While I was helping Richard with this, he started coming up with contingency plans, and saying how the basement would act as their Alamo. Not a great analogy, considering they all died, but whatever. I didn't really think it was a good idea to fight in a basement, but Richard quickly blew off my concerns, claiming that the stairs were a natural choke point, so anyone coming down them would be blown away. That night, we discovered the traps worked, and in hindsight, that might have backfired on us. Around 11, there was a deep noise that almost sounded like a yelp that terrifyingly turned into a howl. It was so sudden and loud that we couldn't tell where it was coming from, but we all immediately turned off the light so as not to give away our position, and kept low. And then, like a dark choir emerging from the blackened woods, hissing and aggressive grunting began, completely surrounding Richard and Sarah's home. We were all frozen to the spot when one of them ran up to the house. I couldn't see it coming from the room we were in, but it was so big and angry that I could feel it approaching. Suddenly, It sounded like Bigfoot was using the wall as a punching bag. When the sound of heavy pounding on the wall stopped, it was punctuated by a single howl full of hate. Then, there was nothing. For a long while, I thought I might have gone deaf, but then Sarah broke the silence. "Movement," Sarah said, pointing into the darkened tree line. "Two of them. At least," Richard agreed. I didn't look in the direction they were looking. My eyes were fixed on the outline of something behind a different tree. I couldn't have taken my eyes off it even if I tried. I might not have been able to see its eyes, but I could feel them staring into the back of my skull. The video recording again proved useless. There was movement and something was shown running up to the house, but it was too out of focus to be useful. When the sun came up, Sarah made some more phone calls, as if bothering the lab would somehow speed things up. As she was doing this, Richard and I went outside to inspect the damage. The wall looked better than I expected. Luckily, what was punched was brick and mortar, and not siding like the rest of the house. Still, though, we could see where the beast's fists had landed. Each blow left behind craters that would put any boxer to shame. After that, Richard dragged me along to inspect the traps. Most hadn't been triggered, as if Bigfoot and his family could easily spot them. But one of the miniature tiger pits had been stepped on. Richard and I both knew that this was the reason for the pissed-off Bigfoot the night before. The smart move would have been to get out of there. But we didn't. Richard was confident that if it came to it, he could defend the house. And Sarah wasn't about to leave the place that she'd learned to call home. I can't say I blame either of them. They were armed, had already proved that they could kill one. And if this was my house, I guess I might not have abandoned it either. Besides, the carcass in the freezer was worth more than its weight in gold, and we had nowhere else to bring it. If we left then, we might as well kiss those millions of dollars goodbye. Neither spoke more than a dozen words to me or each other that afternoon. Both had laser focus on whatever it was they were working on. Richard set up more traps, and when he was done, he dug out trenches under all the windows, so it would be more difficult for Bigfoot to climb in that way. At least, that was what he said when I asked him what he was doing. Sarah was also doing all sorts of busy work. From loading all the magazines so the guns could be quickly loaded after the weapons were fired, to even welding together something called a Czech hedgehog in the garage to slow them down if they managed to get in the house. These metal monstrosities each must have weighed 100 or more pounds, but we managed to get 3 of them into the house by the time the sun went down. Since I hardly had any sleep over the previous few nights, I tried to squeeze in some winks in the spare bedroom after a late supper. Richard and Sarah were both equally tired and stressed, but unlike me, they didn't seek rest. What made them feel better was prepping for a violent confrontation. When I woke up, a few hours had passed, and it was just a little after midnight. You know the feeling of confusion when you wake up in a strange place? It might only last a second, but it's there. Well, this time, it was exacerbated by only having 4 hours of sleep in 3 days, and the stress from feeling you're being stalked by Bigfoot. This was made even worse because I woke up in total darkness. I don't know what happened to cause me to wake up, but I assume there must have been some sound that stirred me. Because just before my mind cleared of fog, I heard gunshots coming from upstairs. I don't know how many shots were fired, but they were shot very rapidly. Unlike my cousin and his wife, I wasn't born with a rifle in my hand. So, as soon as I heard these noises, I was on the floor, covering my head the way I was taught in school, as if that would have made any difference in that situation. Habits are hard to break, I guess. I don't know how long I stayed like that before standing up, hoping I could make a dash for someplace safe. Not that there was anywhere I could go. But as soon as I was on my feet, Richard and Sarah were running down the stairs, with flashlights and guns in hand. A moment later, I could hear holes being punched in the walls. Sarah flipped the couch over to make a barricade at the base of the stairs, and Richard started silently praying as he loaded one shell at a time into his shotgun. "Where's your gun?" Sarah asked me about the gun they lent me during my stay, but I was too shocked to speak. "Useless," Sarah complained, before turning her attention back up to the stairs. What felt like minutes passed, without a sound other than our breathing and the occasional creak from upstairs. "How many were there?" I asked. Richard only whispered one word. "Lots." In the glow the flashlights provided, I could see just how terrified they really were. Sarah might have hidden her fear as anger, and Richard hid his by talking a big game and going on wild rants, but the truth was that the guns in their hands did nothing to build confidence. We listened carefully for any clue on where the Bigfoots were, but this was very hard since they were oddly light-footed. The silence was eerie, and only in hindsight do I realize that as we were listening for them, they were doing the same to us. As sudden as it was violent, an arm burst through the ceiling, and a powerful hand grabbed Richard. The hand was so large it enveloped his face. He struggled for a moment, but the beast's hands were too powerful, and attempted to pull him through the hole it had just created. Richard didn't fit, so it ended up just bashing his skull against the wooden boards a few times. He was limp at the first impact, but there were more attempts, and each time it sounded as though his skull was getting shattered. By the time any of us could jump in and help, the hand had squeezed into a fist, turning Richard's face into jelly. Sarah's scream quickly turned to rage, and she blindly started blasting through the ceiling. Me, on the other hand, I ran. After seeing what I had just witnessed, I knew I didn't have a chance if I stood and fought, but figured survival might be possible if I could hide. I could have said to Sarah that hiding was our best chance, but I have no idea if she would have even listened. I didn't try. That's the point. I didn't do anything to save anyone other than myself from this point on. I'll admit that. Call me a coward if you like, but you weren't there and you cannot judge me. At first, I ran to the spare bedroom to hide under the bed, but there wasn't any gap to get under. Then I thought about the closet, but it didn't have a door. Inhuman screaming came from upstairs, from around finding its mark, causing Sarah to shoot taunts as she picked up Richard's loaded shotgun. She was too distracted to notice me as I ran out of the room, in search of a new place to hide. I thought about hiding behind the water heater, the washing machine, and the dryer, but each were too close to the wall for this to be possible. More fists came through the ceiling, dangerously close to Sarah, who was firing at their every attempt. She was so scared, and those things were so fast, that I don't think she even noticed that some of the shots were whizzing by my ear. I didn't tell her to be more careful. At that moment, I just wanted to hide. That's when I remembered that the freezer was on wheels, and could easily be pushed far enough away from the wall that I could hide behind it. The shooting stopped shortly after I leapt over the freezer, and tried to get as small as I could. I was afraid they would know I was there, but I had hoped that all the shooting and sounds of violence would have drowned out any noises that I made. Just as I heard Bigfoot's family stomping down the stairs, I opened the freezer door to give myself more room to hide. Since Bigfoot is so tall, I would have been easily spotted without it. And also to offer them what I assumed they wanted. I don't know how I knew that they just wanted the body back. I guess it was more of a feeling than anything. From the other room, I could hear Sarah pleading, but the only response she got was a growl that sounded as though they were powered by lungs capable of moving tides. Then I heard a stomp, and a sickening crack that I knew was bone. Sarah's screaming was replaced by the sound of a wet sheet being torn in two. As I squeezed myself between the wall and the back of the freezer, I held my breath, shut my eyes as though my life depended on it. Because it did. After a few long moments, I heard heavy breathing get closer. When the Bigfoot saw the carcass in the freezer, they wailed so loudly that I thought I would go deaf and the glass would shatter. Thankfully, it didn't last. And when it ended, one of them stumbled over to the freezer to take its family member away. The others followed, the sounds of whimpering trailing behind them. I don't know how long I waited there before coming out, but when I did, the sun was up, and I could see carnage everywhere. The basement was covered in blood, but both Richard and Sarah's bodies were gone. Upstairs was worse. It looked as though a hurricane ran through the walls, like the Kool-Aid Man had decided to rub its feces everywhere. I had no idea what to do. People died, but what was I gonna do? Call the cops and tell them Bigfoot's family did it? Best case scenario was they would suspect me of being insane and not believe me. Worst case, I would get arrested and charged with double homicide. Sarah's phone nearly gave me a heart attack when it buzzed on the kitchen table. And when I saw who was calling, I started to cry. Dr. Lillian Corbeck. I didn't answer the phone. What was the point? To tell her that we lost the body? The police had a lot of questions in the following days, and I provided them with as many answers as I could. But it wasn't enough to hide the fact that they all thought I was a murderer, who was also a few cups short of a cupboard. Thankfully, there wasn't enough evidence to support this, so they let me go. I wish I could give you a happier ending, but I can't. The most I can do is plead with you to learn from our mistakes. Leave Bigfoot alone. His family are more savage than you could ever expect.
Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Group Horror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you, which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.